Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. And this is Ion Africa, our weekly seminary series. I'm very delighted today to have with us Dr. Sibel Kusimba, who is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. Dr. Sibel Kusimba has conducted anthropological fieldwork in Kenya on topics ranging from inter-ethnic cooperation to leadership to environmental change to the origin of trade. Since 2012, she has explored the impact of digital money and digital finance in Kenya. Her book, Reimagining Money, Kenya in the Digital Finance Revolution, explores digital money in Kenya, a leading site for financial technology. The book describes the myriad new uses and practices with digital money, including e-money transfer, digital loans, and crowdfunding. Professor Kusimba's mobile money research has also been published in the peer-reviewed journals, Information Technology in International Development, the African Studies Review, and Economic Anthropology. She has spoken to the East African, the Voice of America, and Business Daily Africa about mobile money in Kenya, and her research has been featured in the Next Billion. Professor Kusimba has garnered numerous grants, including 3 National Science Foundation grants, 3 granted through the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion, and 2-year-long Fulbright appointment through the U.S. Department of State to Kenya. Her book, African Foragers, was named an outstanding academic book by the American Library Association. So thank you so very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to have you. So I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sar. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the African Studies Center at Michigan State University for inviting me. I'd also like to thank Dr. White for inviting me as well. I heard that she may have had something to do with this, so I'd like to thank her for inviting me as well. I have followed her work in Western Kenya with women and how they engage with financial technologies and mobile technologies and mobile communication over the years. And I think it's really very, very important critical work that academics need to be doing in order to push industry and designers to really live up to their claims about inclusion and access and benefit. And so much of my work is really in the same vein. I have a little bit broader perspective, more on the anthropology and the culture of the use of digital payment technologies in Kenya. I'm an anthropologist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, a little bit about the kind of broad overview that's in my book. But for the most part, I wanted to start with a little bit of new things that I'm doing that kind of come out of the book, in particular with regard to COVID-19 and its impact on the use of digital finance in Kenya. So I think what I'm going to do now is show you my presentation, begin at the beginning, and just talk a little bit about crowdfunding, financial technologies, and what all of this looks like in Kenya with COVID-19. So, okay, figure out how to. All right, so crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, when people think of crowdfunding, they often think of GoFundMe. This is a really very well-known platform where people come to raise money. And there's all different kinds of crowdfunding. We may think of medical crowdfunding, crowdfunding for personal financial needs, but there is also crowdfunding for artistic projects or for new startups or business ventures, which is sometimes called equity crowdfunding. So the whole concept of coming together on the internet and raising money for a variety of projects, whether personal, business related, artistic, is a relatively new and somewhat surprising application of the new financial technologies. That is to say that with the rise of the internet, we have new kinds of finance that go beyond the services and the products that are offered by traditional banking. So crowdfunding would be a really good example of financial technologies or fintech. And it has been actually surprisingly one of the most popular and most successful from the provider's perspective, examples of financial technologies. The success of these technologies, I think, is also the crystallization of the dilemma of financial technologies as well. Here is an op-ed in USA Today, written by Tim Cadigan, who is the CEO of GoFundMe, again, one of the largest, certainly in the United States, the largest crowdfunding platform. And he noted that during coronavirus, there was a huge increase in Americans going to the internet and trying to fundraise for food, for their rent, for medical care. And we saw all of this in the wake of the attendant economic and health crisis that prevailed with COVID-19. So in this op-ed, he actually steps back from having responsibility to take care of Americans struggling to pay for rent, food, medical bills, and so on, and basically says, well, Congress should pass more, aid and assistance to people who are struggling right now. Don't expect GoFundMe to do it. But of course, the irony of that is that, oh shoot, I'm so sorry that something is happening there. Something is happening, like some of my slides have sound on them. I'm so sorry. So I'm gonna have to skip that one. I don't know what happened there. I've been following these issues in Kenya to basically explain what is happening. Sorry, now I'm actually completely thrown. I didn't realize that there was. Maybe I could just. Okay.
We're not hearing any sounds though.
This is the website that I've been working with. It's called M-Changa. M-Changa is a kind of like a GoFundMe website or platform that is based in Nairobi. It's of course much smaller than GoFundMe, but it is the largest crowdfunding platform in sub-Saharan Africa right now. That is according to the chief financial officer of Mchanga. Changa in Kiswahili means to collect. So Mchanga means sort of to use mobile means to collect funds. So I began working with Mchanga in about 2015. They hired me in order to help them scale their product and design their product and make it more inclusive to different kinds of Kenyans who would come onto this crowdfunding website and raise money. And just like GoFundMe, you can raise money for pretty much anything on Mchanga. You can start a business. You can raise money for medical care. Another very popular thing on the Mchanga website is raising money for family events such as funerals, weddings. That is a little bit where the cultural context of the importance of these kinds of events to African family life really comes out, because it ends up being a very popular thing that people do on Mchanga. So I began to study this website. I've been working with users. I have been talking with designers. I've also been looking at social media in terms of some of the social behaviors and social media cultures around raising money. And if you're familiar with Kenyan Twitter, you know how important money is on Kenyan Twitter and how much fundraising there is going on. And one thing that really comes out is the importance of social networks and, family connections and friends to helping Kenyans deal with any kind of crisis, medical, school fees, and the like. So here's just an example from Kenyan Twitter where someone is thanking, their friends and relatives and other contacts and for raising 4.3 million Kenyan shillings, which is like $43,000. So it's an enormous amount of money, actually. And this is something I think really important to realize when studying these kinds of circulations and fundraising events in the African context, which is that the amount of money that can be raised in the Kenyan context is quite large. In fact, relative to things like average income that you might look at, statistics around average income, you'd immediately notice that Kenyans are much better at fundraising than the average American. They are extremely generous. They are also enmeshed in these support networks where they give and borrow and lend and receive so freely. And what that does is creates this really fertile cultural context where, these fundraising campaigns are enormously productive relative to what you might think of as the material, the approximate material resources that, say, the average Kenyan person has. It's really quite interesting. It makes you think sort of more creatively as an anthropologist about what money is and how money moves and what enables people to circulate and bring velocity to money. So I've been thinking about those questions a lot in my work. So this is, again, the crowdfunding platform. And it's a really kind of a very small, it's a quintessential kind of startup story, from business, the kind of business anthropology of the digital startup. It's got all of that romance to it, if you like. It was started in 2012 as a 2-person startup with 6 employees. The fundraising needs that people come to on Mchanga are health. Number 2 is funerals, and number 3 is weddings. So again, those like rituals of family life are really important here. There is a relatively large fee that is extracted for any user of the platform. In other words, if you decide to fundraise for your wedding on Mchanga, once you've finished fundraising and you'd like to take your money out, you have to pay 4.25% as a fee to the company. And basically that's how they make their money. And crowdfunding platforms make money in different ways. In this particular business model, then what really matters to the company is how much money people raise, not necessarily how many campaigns are on there or how many campaigns reach a goal and so on. But these different ways of devising the business model do matter in the end. So for Mchanga, they need to make money on the overall amount of money that is raised. Another important thing they do is that they bring together all these different payment methods and they allow people to participate and to create one pot of money that has been generated by transfers or donations using different kinds of payment methods. So they will take a lot of their donations through M-Pesa. That's in fact the most common method, digital payment platform that they use. Airtel, they also take Airtel, Equitel from Equity Bank. They can take Visa or MasterCard payments or PayPal payments internationally. And they also accept ACH or bank draft donations. And that's actually one of the biggest value addeds they provide, is that they enable people to take all these different payments that people are using in this ecosystem and they kind of bring things together. And that's a major reason why people like to use M-Changa. They also do what they call verify the fundraiser. Like, if you have a relative in the hospital, what you have to do on M-Changa is provide some kind of proof that that person is in the hospital, like a medical bill or a doctor's note. And this kind of verification is really, really important because in Kenya on crowdfunding, and this is true in the United States as well, one of the issues around crowdfunding is fraud. There are huge amounts of morally questionable campaigns that are out there, but there are also many, many examples of fraudulent campaigns that are out there. In fact, in some ways, some of these fraudulent campaigns, even in the United States, have kind of entered into the popular culture. And so there are moral and ethical issues around crowdfunding that I can say more about that just, come up right away. The platform tries to give people some measure of, transparency and security and, all the good things that, make money real and make these campaigns legitimate in the eyes of the users. They're only partly successful, of course, but that's part of what it was interesting. The users, I don't want to talk too long today because I know how these Zoom things go, but the users and the people who shaped and created Mchanga really see what they are doing as something very African, which is kind of interesting, even though these crowdfunding platforms are really more of a global sort of financial practice. People in Kenya really feel, many people who use the platform really feel that they are kind of returning to a kind of communal or group sense of money that is very traditional and very African for the people who use it, which is actually kind of interesting, and I can say more about it. Again, family membership is very important to these fundraisers. Women and matriarchs of families are the most successful fundraisers on this platform. And this emerged from my research, and it also emerged from quantitative questionnaire type information that the Mchanga platform collected on its users. The most successful campaigns that raise the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time are started by women. Additionally, successful campaigns achieve a lot of momentum or velocity really quickly. In other words, when you start your fundraiser in 24 hours, you've got to get people to contribute. And then that gives your fundraising campaign velocity, and people start sharing on social media and Twitter, oh, so-and-so is in the hospital, Uncle so-and-so is in the hospital, or our wonderful friends are getting married. And those campaigns that have velocity have another really interesting gender component to them, which is that women not only start those campaigns, but they get other women to contribute early. So women tell their female friends, their sisters, their mothers, their daughters to contribute early. So these actions of women and connections between women end up being really important to these fundraising campaigns. Another important thing, social media influence. Again, is your campaign trending on Twitter? And those are the kinds of things that get people moving. So, they've had about 300,000 contributors. This was information from 2018. They like to be as active on Facebook and WhatsApp and Twitter as possible in order to help these campaigns grow. But I was brought in 2015, 2016, and at that time, and things have improved a little bit, but it's still the case, a lot of the fundraisers that people were running on Mchanga really weren't successful at all. In fact, in 2015, only 10% of their fundraisers had raised more than $50. So what was really happening on this website is that most of the campaigns, the vast majority of them, were not particularly successful. Campaigns that were successful on Mchanga were often campaigns run by philanthropic organizations rather than individuals. And there is a very interesting realm for philanthropy and the work of local charities, local and international charities, and that whole intersection that is really important to study with crowdfunding in developing settings. It really intersects with kind of existing ideas about charity, philanthropy, non-governmental organizations, and the like. So they also reported that they had about 24,000 fundraisers with $3 million raised. And this is figures from 2015. If you were to compare this, of course, with something like GoFundMe, the numbers would be a lot less. But given the context, it's actually, again, what I said before, it's a relatively productive context for fundraising when you consider that Kenya is a much smaller country than the United States, and where you consider that measures of personal income or wealth, if you can talk about that, tend to be much less. In fact, there's an overperformance. One could say that Kenyan financial technologies overperform in terms of the success of fundraising or crowdfunding in this time. Okay. Nevertheless, I mean, part of what I did in my study was to document so many barriers. And again, this is a little bit, one has to adopt here and appreciate and understand some of the mindset and the lingo of Silicon Valley when you talk about technologies. There is a kind of assumption that scaling is the only way to evaluate the success of any business venture. And because I was a consultant, because I was paid by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help Mchanga to see what would enable them to scale, a lot of my initial work was in documenting, well, you know, if you wanted this particular website to be more successful, what would you need? So there are actually so many barriers here that really face the imaginaries about scaling and connecting and digitizing everything that have been the imperative that Silicon Valley and other kind of digital financial and just digital technology in general, platforms and apps and industry have really been about kind of leveraging all over the world. First of all, the barriers are technological. The lack of access that still prevails, especially in rural areas. And here, you know, I won't say too much because Dr. White has done so much work in this area. The assumption that people of all walks of life will easily engage and upload and be active on these platforms is really quite naive at the end of the day. There are many barriers that are actually created by the existing infrastructure of, you know, agents and connectivity and so on, network. It's almost always, there are many people left behind, not just in rural areas, but in urban areas as well. The high cost of smartphones and internet activity, of course. Even using SMS. And so Mchanga kind of also offers like SMS connectivity, sort of more inclusive kind of text message interaction with their employees. So you don't need a smartphone to use Mchanga, but their SMS initiation process and other aspects of that relationship is, you know, oftentimes very difficult and problematic. And I've tried myself to initiate fundraisers using an SMS, and you just get tangled up in other people's names and the difficulty of communicating and so on. The fee is extremely high outside of a kind of more affluent user who can afford the fees. And this is probably one of the biggest things I discovered doing my study, which is that, you know, people for whom social capital was very important used this platform. And for them, the 4.25% fee was worth it. They already had very strong social networks. They had goals around helping friends and relatives, developing connections often in high places. There are a large number of elite families who use Mchanga. And so if you know Kenya and you'd like to look through some of the stories, you'll notice, you know, relatively high profile families and people who use Mchanga. So it's almost like a who's who of some of the elite people of Kenya, if you like. So it's really not like an inclusive model at all. the other issue is just the trust deficit that really prevails in Kenya in general. Low-income people who were invited to try the platform, who were invited to try the SMS initiation using a feature phone, really had a lot of mistrust of this. Harambe or fundraising has become associated with political elites, with patronage, with corruption. And so this kind of optimistic vision of everybody just getting together and, crowdfunding their way out of poverty, or crowdfunding their way around, problems, or, kind of mutually solving problems together, kind of ran into some of the realities of the political situation in Kenya, and the realities of some of the kind of moral and ethical questions that swirl around how money moves and who sends money to who, and all of that, and how that works in Kenya, right? As it does here. I mean, these questions are universal in a lot of ways. I'm going to skip that because I'm kind of going. Sorry, I have some slides and I don't understand why they have tapes in them. Anyway, so I will skip some of those. But then I went to Mchanga during COVID. I did a bunch of interviews with people who were raising money using M-Changa during the March 2020 lockdown. And this was a really fascinating thing, because what happened during this March 2020 lockdown was that there was this, sense of urgency, this sense of emergency, this sense of fear and vulnerability. And Mchanga actually had one of its biggest fundraising years in 2020. And in particular, during that March period, so many philanthropic organizations, as well as individuals who are motivated to help, got onto Mchanga and started fundraising. So I interviewed people from Caritas Nairobi, which is a very large Catholic charity in Nairobi. I also interviewed smaller kind of social entrepreneurs, a really interesting organization called Cup of Uji, which fundraises to bring Uji to hungry school children. I also had the pleasure of interviewing Asha Jafar, who is a journalist. She started a food drive in Kibera during March 2020 to kind of help people whose livelihoods got cut off. Because of course, as informal workers, the lockdown was, perceived as very oppressive during that time. And her food drive was written up in the New York Times, and she was also had to kind of battle police who didn't want her out during the lockdown. And she was delivering food to people, and she was assaulted by a policeman. And so this was a very big kind of event in Kenya, and really highlighted, some of the issues and debates around lockdowns in Africa, which in many ways have been different from the issues around lockdowns that we've had, say, in the United States, for example. And I'm sure many people in the audience know this, of course, but in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, lockdowns were really, really detrimental to people who worked informally. So there was a tremendous cost of economic income. In fact, the World Bank reported that 5% of Kenyans actually moved into poverty during 2020 because of their inability to work, as informal workers. There have also been cases of political oppression and police violence and so on during lockdown. So this was part of what motivated people to come and fundraise. But the downside of all of this is that this moment of urgency, where so many people got onto Mchanga to try to help, didn't really last. And all of the three people I talked to all said that once this sense of normalcy returned after this first wave, and I guess it's just a weird kind of, it's sort of a subjective sense of, well, what was normal and what is not normal. Again, since this whole COVID thing, it's hard to know, are we in a period of crisis? Are we in normal yet? Or are we back in crisis? It's kind of like up and down. But when I did these interviews with these three individuals who were kind of social entrepreneurs trying to help people, and I did these interviews in October and November of last year. So there was that moment of normal, I guess, that had come back. And all of them said that that sense of urgency that prevailed in the spring of 2020 had been lost. For example, Ms. Jafar tried to fundraise again for the Kibra food drive earlier this year, 1 year after the initial lockdown, Nairobi went into lockdown again. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but anyway, 1 year after the 2020 lockdown in April in Nairobi, there was another lockdown, and Asha stepped in again to try to fundraise. And this time she had a much harder time finding people willing to give. So I asked people, what happened to that moment of, of giving? Like how, is that something sustainable, or is that something just happened once and now it's disappeared again and we're back to our normal lives? And I think it's kind of a little bit of a mystery in terms of just, it's something to think about in terms of like what compels people to give. When do people give, and when do they refuse to give? And how do technologies that allow you to simply push a button and send money, do they sustain a kind of sense of interconnection or generosity? Or, how do people engage with these attempts to get us to give that have become so much easier now that we all, or many of us have, the ability to send money at the touch of a button, right? So now I actually have a lot more slides. I have a lot more slides that relate to my book more. And I don't know if I really want to show those right now, because I feel like I've talked for a lot of time. And what I think I could do is maybe stop and see if people have any questions instead. And then I could maybe show a whole bunch of more slides later on. But I think maybe I could see if there are any questions just to give people a break, because these Zoom things become very easily extremely long and intense. So I will stop and see if people have any questions.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I think somebody wants to speak. Let me allow them to talk. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sibel, for sharing your research work in Kenya. I have two questions. I'll ask one for now and then the second one later on. I will have wanted you to talk more about women being successful in crowdfunding, because gender is a very important variable, especially in Africa. How come women are so successful in crowdfunding?
Oh, great, thank you. I just lost my screen there for a second. Okay, so yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I have more slides related to this, but I think I'd prefer to just talk a little bit. But this is something that is not just the case in Kenya. I did not know this, because this book I have written, which I could say more about, but this book ended up being so much about gender, and I think, well, women specifically, but also gender. But part of the issue is that this whole kind of financial inclusion effort has, I think, for several decades now, focused on women. And it is, I think, easy to fundraise because women are perceived, particularly women who are from the third world, are somehow perceived as needy or as needing help, or as somehow kind of an appropriate idea in the mind of what a beneficiary looks like. Women also have, of course, a lot of responsibility and activity with money, and they sustain their families and their neighborhoods, and they use money to help other people. And this is something that I've documented in the book, but it really fits in with what so many other scholars have found, which is that, women give money. Having access to money gives women, a way to have real impact and to become people of importance and leadership in their communities. The downside of this is, well, first of all, you need money in order to become one of these women who can help others and who can achieve a certain amount of, prestige and importance through that. So it's not all women who can benefit from something like using a digital payment service. It's only women who have access to money, which sounds like a pretty obvious point, but it's often forgotten in these big discussions of let's just give everybody a phone, and then all these centuries of of marginalization will magically disappear. And the second thing I think that's really important to note is that this work that women do with their phones and with their money in places like Kenya, where they use finance, to uplift their communities and to fulfill some of the objectives of development, it often involves an enormous amount of work and labor and stress on their part. And I think crowdfunding is really kind of a quintessential example of that. I first thought when I wrote the book that, these women crowdfunding on Mchanga were doing something uniquely Kenyan or African or something. I felt that it was because of the cultural context and the way that women are important in families that the Kenyan women on Mchanga were able to achieve this position. But I've since learned of other studies, for example, Nora Kenworthy at the University of Washington and some of her students who have also done like a series of really interesting studies with crowdfunding. And it turns out in the United States as well, the most successful crowdfunding campaigns on GoFundMe are run by women. So women are doing a lot of work out there, mostly to help other people. To what extent are they actually benefiting themselves? I think it's a really important question to ask, and it brings up the question of who really benefits from financial technologies. And so, I think the idea of women being important can be good, but it is also a way in which these technologies can potentially become predatory. What Nora Kenworthy has found is that women in the United States, and she's looked at gender, she's looked at race, and what she's found is that fundraising campaigns here in the United States, if they are run by white people, if they are run by more affluent people, they are definitely more successful. So what happens is that African Americans, for example, or low income people may get on GoFundMe, but they will, spend a lot of time creating a video or writing a story that is designed to pull the heartstrings and to compel people to give. And what really has happened is that they tend to have very relatively unsuccessful campaigns. And so I don't remember the exact figures right now, but what's really interesting about her study is that it was also quantitative, and she was able to show that there is a real difference in productivity between white and African-American crowdfunding campaigns. So it raises this issue of predatory finance, and all of the labor that is done to coordinate a fundraising campaign and the extent to who really benefits from those campaigns. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Susan. You can speak.
Hi, Sibel. It's Susan White here, and I'm so happy you could join us. And I want to encourage everybody to read your book. It's beautifully written and a thoughtful piece of research. And my question really has to do with, you've talked about Mchanga, and I'm especially interested in how you talk about and use human-centered design. I mean, it's an approach that's popular in the research community I work in, human-computer interaction. Technology companies love to do human-centered design. I think there are a lot of valid critiques of the approach. It's exploitative. It never really results in outcomes that benefit communities. But in my mind, you sort of do it well. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on how you use human-centered design in your work with how it's sort of used within these technology communities, and sort of what distinguishes your use of this design approach compared to, I guess, I don't know if mainstream, but more traditional uses of the approach to design technology.
So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the question. I think it's a really great question. And, as like a more academic anthropologist, I think like there's so much sort of arrogance in the field of anthropology in a way, like especially the more academic times. Those times are gone now, thank God. But I mean, the way I was trained was like, only academics can really do this right. Only anthropologists can really understand life right, because you have to go somewhere and live there for, forever and get to know people. And of course, you'll be magically welcomed into the community and you'll be accepted as a member of the community, but you'll be able to see everything better than the people who are actually in that world because you're an anthropologist. So you'll have, you know, a kind of superior view of you know, the theory of people's lives or whatever it is, and anybody else who tries to study people from any other perspective couldn't possibly be doing anything right. And so that was a little bit the bias, you know, I have to say, but just as the world has changed and as I got involved with the Mchanga team, I really thought their human-centered design thing was pretty cool. Like I think that there's been so much cross-fertilization between human-centered design practitioners and anthropologists. You know, I don't think that the anthropologists really have much to argue about being quote unquote better. First of all, a lot of the work we do isn't very good either. The idea that everyone welcomes us and that we're a member of the group is, of course, just, that was like a big power trip and a big fantasy, I think, that, so we backed away from that. But what I thought was interesting with working with Mchanga is that we developed these personas, and what this team did, this was a human-centered design team called Think Place. They are originally based in Australia, I believe. And, you know, their approach was like on steroids, like anthropology research on steroids. So like, let's go out there and interview all these people. We'll drive out there, we'll get there at midnight, and we'll just interview people for 36 hours and come back. And, you know, I was like, wait, where's my water bottle? Like, you know, everything was just moving really, really fast. But I have to admit that I was impressed with some of the ways that they kind of targeted their approach. And, you know, what we wanted to do was really try to see, okay, what is the real diversity of people that is out there? You know, if you're trying to scale this product, which heretofore is only used by, you know, relatively affluent, again, it's Kenya, so, you know, the word affluent is very problematic, but people who have capital, social or economic, I use the term wealth in people in my book just to try to get away from that. But I mean, you know, the idea is that this product is being used by people who have the web of connections and who can come up with 4.25%. And, you know, could this be, you know, the idea of trying to make it available to everyone, you know, involves figuring out who is out there. And so what this team did was, you know, we went to, you know, very rural areas outside of internet access. You know, we looked at people with disabilities who, you know, had all kinds of not say problems, but their way of, you know, these technologies were not designed for people with disabilities to access, right? I mean, and so, you know, we looked at all the ways that this concept of inclusion was really a failure. I ended up being really impressed with what they did. I don't know if anthropologists can be on their high horse anymore, and I said to myself afterwards, like, well, if I wasn't an academic, I think I would really enjoy human-centered design. The only thing about it is that everything is on a time clock. And so, you know, they have to write these incredible reports and turn them around within 48 hours or something. And so it's really, really quick. And it's really not the same as an ethnographic study. It's not as inductive, right? It's very deductive. It's very targeted. Let's look for barriers, you know? And so, whereas an anthropologist tends to be more inductive, oh, I'm just going to hang out here for 2 years and write down everything that I can write down. And that's the luxury that we just don't have anymore. I think nobody has that anymore. So I think anthropologists would really benefit from some of these like very targeted techniques. You know, they are, and I think a lot of the lore and the romance of anthropology is a fiction anyway. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know. Because it was new for me, I thought it was really cool. I guess I'm sure there are all of these things that are wrong with it that I didn't really appreciate because it was new and interesting to me. And I felt that it was a way to make some of what is important to anthropologists doable in the business world, right? Like, so I felt from that perspective, it was, you know, it's really kind of revolutionary because it enables, you know, some of the ideas that are important to anthropology, you know, to be visible and to be, you know, real for people who are designing things. I thought it was cool.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Yeah, I think. Well, I don't know if I'm guilty, but yeah, I think anthropologists have it all figured out. So being reminded that they have the same struggles that every other researcher has to, I think that's a useful reminder.
Thank you very much. I think, Omar, you can speak now. Did you raise your hand to talk, Omar? Okay, we'll come back. Let's give Brian. Brian, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for such a great initial talk. My name is Brian Geyer. Actually, I'm a PhD anthropology student who's currently in Nairobi conducting dissertation research. So I wanted to ask you specifically about, you're mentioning generally about Harambee being tied to political machinations at the moment, and essentially a move away from more ujamaa practices. And so I really wanted to ask about, and related to a specific thing that I'm seeing here. So my research has to do with the tech sector in Kenya specifically, and I've recognized maybe over the last 4 or 5 years this move away from collective improvement attitudes and reframing of people's goals as being more essentially profit driven, which I would assume is related to VC funding coming from the US and elsewhere. So my question to you is, you were talking about seeing a similar shift in Mchanga contributions, and I'm wondering if you think that that is a broader trend for Kenya as a whole, or more broadly than, say, the tech sector more narrowly, or even as you were talking about more affluent individuals as a little bit broader. But do you think it goes beyond that, or do you think this is more of a trend that we're seeing in these particular populations that you don't see in others?
So great question. Thank you so much, and thank you for tuning in from Nairobi. That's really amazing that that you're able to do that. So if I understand your question correctly, and this is a little bit the kind of narrative that many of the people I spoke with seem to embrace. So, for example, one of the CEO of M-Changa is a Kenyan gentleman whose father was the former governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. And so, in fact, this man and his father, this father-son team, kind of hatched the idea to create the M-Changa fundraising platform using the model of their own family fundraising networks. And so this is a kind of cultural practice that is, of course, really, really widespread, and is ever since colonialism, of course, as a kind of coping mechanism, people have shared and transferred money and brought money together in pools, in family life and friends and so on. So that is kind of the basis of just, what survival was like for people. And I think that's, of course, the origin of digital payment in Africa itself. And of course, many people know the story, but I'll just tell it briefly for people who don't. But the initial pay-as-you-go phone, starting in the very late 20th century or the early aughts throughout sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the spread of the mobile phone was enabled by a kind of pay-as-you-go financing system where people could buy airtime in small amounts using a scratch card. And of course, when people began to send and receive those codes or use airtime as a form of value for paying for things, that was the kind of innovation that eventually led to digital payment and Pesa, of course. So behind that innovation is really the local culture of giving and sharing, I think. And people like the Mchanga team really make reference to that model, that this is a kind of collective and this is a group. and that money is good when it's shared and where it's for everybody, where it supports the common good. And, you know, this is, I think, a really important idea behind what many people think finance is or should be in this setting. Now, the question becomes, what happens when the technology sector or when investors and when new startups move into this space? You know, do they have other models? Do they tend to see their customers more as individuals, right? Is there an attempt to individuate money and to teach people to think about money as belonging just to them, right? So when, for example, when banks or, you know, other NGOs begin financial education training, you know, much of what they teach people to do is things like, you know, budgeting and saving. And, you know, there's a much more individuated sense that, you know, good financial decisions are about individuals, you know, learning to manage their own funds. And there's also, I think, fair to say, an assumption in some of this perspective or some of this education that when your relatives ask you for money, you know, that this is a kind of dilemma, an ethical dilemma of finance. Are you supposed to say yes, or, you know, how do you negotiate those demands from the social network? In economics, there's something called the rotten kin problem, which is the idea that, you know, Africans have rotten kin that ask them for money all the time. And of course, if you ask Kenyans about this, they'll just tell you story after story after story. They have to turn off their phone. They have to change their SIM card, like, because, you know, especially affluent people are constantly barraged with requests, and they feel, both men and women feel, I think, a huge sense of responsibility. So I think this is really, you know, going to be the main question. These networks of sharing are really where the value is. And so if you're starting a fintech app, let's say like a digital loan app, you know, and everyone's talking about digital loans right now, they're hugely controversial, right? Are you going to cannibalize these networks of sharing and love and generosity? Like, you know, are you just, you know, what is going to happen when these financial providers enter into these networks? Are they going to contribute to the network the way people in them are expected to contribute, right? Like if you ask for money, well, people will say, well, you know, well, did they come when so-and-so died? Did they come to the funeral? Well, if they didn't, I'm not going to answer this person's request because they need school fees, right? Like it's a give and take. And so, you know, the providers, I think, need to think about give and take. Like, if I'm going to profit off of a digital loan, what am I going to also do now to seed this network with funds the way the members also do? Like, you know, and I think that's kind of where things need to go now. And I think one thing they've definitely done is they've tried to individuate people. And there are, if you look at the advertisements, like KCB has an advertisement where there's a fundraiser and, you know, people invite everyone to eat a goat. And then he stands up and he says, well, my wife's in the hospital. And everyone goes, oh my God, no. And then he says, no, I'm just kidding. I don't need your money for my wife who's in the hospital because I got this digital loan from KCB. So I've been respectful of my family. I've been responsible. I've been self-reliant, and I've taken care of this need myself using this financial service provider, right? So it's all about like this subtext of the morality around the sharing and what is an individual versus the group in this context. And so, you know, like, anyway, I completely agree with you that this is like really, really a key question. And, you know, what do people think about that? And you know, where is all of this going to go? And I think without more attention to that basis, I think a lot of the more predatory apps and loans and so on will simply continue. So thank you for that question. I think it's a really good question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification. If you want to write your question in the Q&A section, that's fine. If you want to talk to, that's fine. So Mchanga wanted to ask a question live, but he is having problems with his microphone. So this is his question. Is there any state control in the Mchanga process? Any interest conflict between Mchanga and legally settled humanitarian organization, if any?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand Omar's question, but I think he might be speaking about the regulatory environment, if I'm not mistaken, which I didn't have a chance to talk about. But yes, I mean, there is a very rapidly adapting regulatory environment in Kenya, and it has tended to be on the permissive side ever since the origins of M-Pesa. So there is a famous story where the finance minister, who's now unfortunately deceased, but the finance minister and the CEO of Safaricom had this historic meeting. The finance minister used M-Pesa, discovered that it worked, gave the green light, and then industry and government came together to create this wonderful new ecosystem. And you can look at that story in different ways. The more critical perspective is that the Kenyan government hasn't done enough to ensure the safety of users. There's tons of fraud. There is all kinds of identity theft. There are scams, like a SIM card scam. Where people might call you up or try to get your PIN number, or pretend that they've lost your SIM card and gotten a new one in your name. There are just so many scams. It's a very insecure and very unsafe financial system, according to many observers. So that's the first thing. The regulation has been very light, with the intention of enabling all of this innovation, right? So again, appealing to the Silicon Valley and the investor mindset of let's produce innovation, let's think creatively so that we can develop these new products, right? Interestingly enough, the products are pretty similar to the products you find in other places. They've got crowdfunding, they've got digital debt, which in Kenya is widely used by so many people who take out small loans every day. It's really controversial. In other countries, this kind of small mobile debt is really considered a kind of predatory practice, and I think there is more and more attention to investigating these practices. Mchanga is not a financial. They're not regulated as a bank because they don't take deposits from people. So you see, they get around regulation because they don't really take deposits from people. They're just fundraising. They don't have to be regulated as a bank. And so some of the protections that might be given there aren't necessarily there. What Mchanga told me was what they do is, by raising money for people short term, they avoid some of the greater regulation that they would have to have if they were keeping people's money long term. So it's a disadvantage for them in a way, because they would like to be a kind of collective account, but they want to avoid, instead they avoid that concept entirely, because then they would have to become a bank and they would open themselves up to a lot of regulation. It would drive up their costs, and also learned a little bit working from them. They have 6 employees, all of whom are really hardworking people who also have families themselves. I kind of saw the other side of it, which is that it's really, really hard for businesses to innovate. It's really hard for them to make enough money. All of these things are very, very difficult. And so if you may ask yourself, why isn't there more creativity? Why isn't there more innovation? Why are some of these promises not fulfilled? I think it's also, it is really, really difficult. But I hope that answers the question. I'm not aware of any, can't remember what you said, but I'm not aware of any like specific legal conflict they've gotten into. Perhaps I just am not aware.
Thank you very much. Anne, do you want to talk?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Aura. And thank you so much, Dr. Sibel, for sharing your work. My name is Anne, and I'm from Kenya. And so I'm so excited to hear about your research and your findings because I participate in such activities here. I'm a woman, and we Kenyan women in the States, we have so many what we call chamas. For every week, every month, there's something going on. It's either someone has died, or you're buying that plot, and this is what we use to, this is the culture we got from our mothers. And these are also spaces for us to know each other. In some spaces you join because someone else invited you. Some of it is people from your community, your city. So yeah, it's nice to hear about this charmer, the idea of charmer, or merry-go-round, as we like to call them, now going into technology. I'm interested in finding out how the diaspora community participates in Mchanga, because during COVID-19, our nation really loved on us, because they said, at least from the central bank, they said that we increased our giving by 10%, and we send a lot of money at home. Our economy in Kenya is run by our money. So they say that whereas in 2019 we sent 27 million, during COVID we sent $30 million to Kenya. So I was wondering, in your research, did you find out how Kenyans abroad were driving this Mchanga success? I say this because these movers and shakers of women in Nairobi who would do this easily sometimes belong in associations that have women abroad, and they can rely on them to send money home. So it's either it's class driven. It's where you lived in Nairobi or where you grew up. It's the relatives you have abroad, the old girls association, your profession. Do you ever travel abroad to see people so they know you? So I'm wondering whether it uses that rationale. And secondly, because I worked in the NGO world in Kenya in the 2000s, and what was happening then was that the donor world was not funding much, and a certain word was coined, donor fatigue. So then I was wondering whether that concept can be used to examine Kenyans when they get to a place where their altruistic drive decreases. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. I think you've made so many really, really important points. So, thank you for contributing all that great information. I really think that is so important to appreciate. These activities that women are doing, the diaspora are doing, and what diaspora women are doing are so important. I have a funny story. I just moved to Tampa, Florida, and I happened to meet a Kenyan lady, and it's very funny because I knew her. I had met her only 20 years ago, and now I learned that she was in Tampa, and we met, and she said, "Well, I have just spoken to the central bank about my bank. Many of us here are Kenyan women all over the US. We have a new bank. I've just been speaking to the Central Bank of Kenya, and so I have a bank. Are you Kenyan? I will invite you to join my bank," right? So they're all over. You can go anywhere in the United States and meet a Kenyan lady who is being incredibly enterprising. They are buying plots. This lady told me they are buying plots all over Nairobi, that they have their own assessor, that they have their own, they have their own system in place to find investments, and that to then what they buy plots, of course, they make them smaller, and then they after holding on to them for some time, they will divide the plots, and they've been very, very successful in that way. So this issue of the diaspora, I think, is really, really important, because on the one hand, yes, it shows the strength and the power of these women's networks, but I think it is also creates more social inequality, as Anne already said. For example, in the book, I discuss Mchanga users and women especially. They fundraise for elite schools that they attended. They fundraise for certain members of parliament that they would like to see elected. So, they are also part of a broader set of social and political and cultural changes going on in Kenya right now and in the world, whereby social inequality is increasing and whereby new kinds of class formation are happening. And I think that ultimately the result of Mchanga and similar kinds of financial infrastructures will be more social inequality, not less. And so we have to be careful not to just assume that everything that women do is necessarily great for all women, right? There are lots of other women who, are not able to access even the simplest kinds of, or very basic important forms of inclusion. And Dr. White has shown this. And yet, part of what the development apparatus does is push this very monolithic idea of a woman, as being this, someone who needs help, someone who is disempowered. And, a lot of these discourses around the technology, use gender in this very, not in an intersectional way, but in a kind of simplistic way. And I think we need to push back against that. And, nobody expects people to, everyone has a certain kind of self-interest, but I think one of the ways that I learned to think about this dilemma is that I interviewed a lady in the rural areas in Kenya named Consolata. And, I was asking her to talk about her role in her community. She lives in a very, very impoverished community. She runs a school. Her husband is a former police officer. And so she is one of the few people in her community in Western Kenya. This is a very small village in Western Kenya. Every single day, people come to her for help. People who don't have food, people who are stranded without transport. Children come to her school hungry every single morning. And so, I asked her to kind of draw what that looks like. And so she drew an image of a vessel, of a boat, and she drew herself inside of that. But then she wrote the names of all of her neighbors inside this gigantic boat. And she said, I'm really a vessel and I have to carry all these people. So that's an image that has two faces to it. On the one hand, it's, women stepping forward to carry their communities and, to be, people in a position to help and to give mobility and agency to other people. But it's also at the same time, that image is the potential for predatory finance, because then you make women hold up all of these marginalized and forgotten people, and you make them step into the vacuum that's been created, by the structural changes and the greater social inequality that our world is facing right now. So, the question is like, what are Kenyan women going to do? Because you can't be two people at the same time. Right. So this image of the boat really has me thinking, a great deal. And I think we need to push the discourse to be more intersectional. And, we can't expect people to get away with this idea of women all the time. Women, like there's billions of women out there. So that's not enough.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, do you want to speak?
Mute. Sibel, my second question was about, we know Africa or Kenya specifically could be different from what we see in America. Because when you talk about cultural differences, cultural diversity, are there any similarities or differences you see in crowdfunding or fundraising between Kenya and the US?
Sure. So this is really great. And actually, I had another series of slides about China, because I've also done this research in China. I was there in 2018 and studied a crowdfunding website that they have in China. But I'm glad I didn't show those slides, because I think it kind of gets, I'll just tell you instead a little bit about cross-culturally what I found. So it's very, very interesting, because if you look at, say, the United States, China, and Kenya, you see a bunch of similarities in terms of crowdfunding. First of all, crowdfunding is like a surprisingly popular kind of platform that no one really expected to become as big as it did. So that speaks to, I think, real needs that are out there, real divides and forms of marginalization that are out there. In all three of those countries, medical crowdfunding is an enormous activity, an important activity. In all three of those countries, there are serious deficits and lacks in terms of healthcare. Just to give you an example, when I was working with the Mchanga team, the kind of patriarch of the company, who was a former governor of the Kenyan Central Bank, told me that he was on the way to Kenyatta Hospital. So, you know, we were supposed to talk, and he said, I'm on the way to Kenyatta Hospital. I have a relative who is been hospitalized, and I have to go there, and I have to be there, and I have to help. Because if I'm not there, I'm the most, you know, well-known and prestigious member of my family. And if I'm not there to help, he won't get the care that he deserves. So, you know, these are relatively people in Kenya who are former government officers, very educated people. This person had a PhD from the United States. He's a former governor of the central bank. And yet he's telling me, you know, my situation, my healthcare situation is very precarious, and my relative might not get that help if I'm not there. And this is a real cross-cutting theme. People not having access to care, not having money for care, but also not trusting the quality of the care that they have access to. So this has emerged in all three places. What I found made Kenya special in a way was the influence of funerals and weddings. And I showed one picture of that. And I also interviewed people who really wanted their funeral, their relative's funeral, to be as beautiful and as luxurious as possible in order to communicate the value of the life of that matriarch or patriarch. What I also found in Kenya was the ability to fundraise relatively enormous amounts of money over a very short time. And again, women had this ability. I could show you another slide, but I'm not going to go back to that. But I interviewed a young woman. She was in her early 20s, and her grandfather had just died. So she seeded her fundraising, her Mchanga fundraiser, with 1,000 shillings. That's only $10. And at the end of 2 weeks, they had 100,000 shillings. And just from one tweet that started this whole ball rolling. So large amounts of money are fundraised by people who are considered, you know, income wise, you know, in a certain tier. That's the other thing that economists do, is that they have this very layered view of society where there are all of these levels, and they're missing the way these networks leverage funds, you know, across all different kinds of settings, rural, urban. They don't understand the way African families mobilize money across all these different social worlds. Like, they just don't get it. And it's just like really a unique thing there that I learned. The main thing I was going to say about the Chinese crowdfunding is, you know, a lot of the assumptions people make about how technology is supposed to work in Africa, how we're going to just put in all these infrastructures, everyone's going to get connected, it's going to scale, everything's going to be great, inclusion. If you go to a place where you really see that vision happening, you know, of any place in the world, it's really China. And I just recommend going there and seeing how digital payment and just how technological infrastructures work there. It's just mind-blowing. The inclusion is so much greater there. You know, you can send and receive money using WeChat Pay, and it's so inexpensive. It's free to send money to anybody, you know, who's also on WeChat Pay. And there's a small charge that is leverage, a 0.1% charge is leveraged when you move money from your WeChat wallet into your linked bank account. So if you send someone 10,000 yuan, it only costs 9 won to move that money from your WeChat wallet into your bank account. So it's practically it's an unbelievably cheap service. It's practically free. Definitely there are issues of inclusion in China. I'm not saying there aren't any. There are rural areas where people can't use phones, where people need to cash out and bring money to people. I'm not saying that those things are not there. But what they have produced, and again, because they've got scale, because they have more people who have steady employment, right, factory work and so on. Again, it's not everybody, but they have so much greater scale there, and products that are relatively inexpensive for people. They have created, paradoxically, a much more inclusive digital financial landscape. And of course, all of this is driven by a huge amount of investment from their government, which also raises issues of surveillance and control. And I'm not saying those aren't there, but in terms of inclusion, like, it's just unbelievable, what they have created. For example, there is a fundraising platform called Drop of Water, or Water Drop in English. And they don't charge people any money to fundraise. So you can set up a GoFundMe and they don't even make money that way. So you don't have to pay any fees or anything. They have some of the same issues with their crowdfunding campaigns, not always being successful, but they're free campaigns. That company makes money by charging a tiny, tiny percentage of their users to purchase insurance. So if a small number of people using Drop of Water buy medical insurance, everybody else, and they have 200 million users on their platform because it's China, right? Everybody else fundraises for medical care for free, because they've got scale, they've got 1 billion WeChat Pay users, that's the only way that vision is going to work. If we can somehow provide something that is relatively low cost to a really large amount of people. And, as Dr. Wyke knows, and as many of the people here know, that's not the situation in sub-Saharan Africa right now by a long shot.
Any questions or comments before we leave for today? Thank you so very much. That was fascinating. We appreciate your coming and sharing your research with us. Thank you
so much. I am putting my email in the chat. So if anyone, I enjoyed meeting people here today. If anyone has any further questions or comments, this is my email here. So I encourage people to get in touch. I really enjoyed this. And thank you so much again to Dr. Wyke and to Dr. Saar and to everybody at Michigan State University for inviting me to the Eye on Africa for today. I really enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it too, and the pleasure was ours. Thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you next time. Bye.